When Aaron opened the letter from the HOA, his world crumbled. Remove the garage within 30 days. Furious, he decided to fight. But what he uncovered about the HOA laws shocked him. In court, everything hinged on one crucial moment. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Let's start from the beginning. It was a bright Saturday morning when Aaron Matthews received the letter. He was in his garage, bent over his old car, wiping grease from his hands when his wife, Jenna, burst in, holding an envelope with the HOA's logo. The moment she handed it to him, Aaron's stomach sank. The letter, official and stark, seemed almost mocking as he read it aloud. Dear Mr. Matthews, we regret to inform you that your garage, as currently constructed, violates the community's architectural guidelines and must be removed within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Aaron's heart raced as he reread it, trying to absorb what seemed impossible. His garage, a humble yet cherished space, had been there for years. It wasn't anything extravagant, just enough to store his tools, his motorcycle, and some of the most meaningful memories he had. It was where he'd spent countless hours with his father, working on cars, laughing, and learning. To think that this simple structure was now considered a violation felt absurd. He had never received any prior warnings, no notices, no complaints. How could this be happening? Frustration bubbled up inside him as he threw the letter down, pacing the small garage. He had no intention of letting this go. His pride, his memories, his whole sense of fairness screamed for action. Jenna watched silently, sensing the storm that was building inside him. Without another word, Aaron grabbed his keys, slammed the door behind him, and sped off toward the HOA office, his mind racing. He wasn't just going to accept this. Whoever had sent that letter had no idea who they were dealing with. He was determined to get answers, to confront whoever was behind this. This wasn't just about a garage. It was about his rights, his family, and a system that, as far as Aaron was concerned, had overstepped its bounds. As the office loomed ahead, Aaron's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had no idea what kind of response he'd get, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving until he had an explanation. Aaron's steps echoed on the polished floors of the HOA office as he entered. It was sterile, cold, everything designed to look perfect, the kind of place that made you feel like an outsider the moment you walked in. Behind the desk, Lisa Grant, the board president, didn't even look up. She was typing away at her computer, her fingers tapping rhythmically as if nothing could be more important than whatever she was doing. She finally spoke, her voice sharp and dismissive. Mr. Matthews, I have here a list of violations regarding your garage. She read from the screen, her eyes never leaving the glowing monitor. It doesn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. Too many personal touches, like custom doors and that red color. Her lip curled slightly. We're all about uniformity here. No exceptions. Aaron's fists clenched at his sides. It wasn't the first time he had heard the word uniformity, but hearing it from her, spoken with such cold certainty, made his blood boil. His garage, the one where he had spent hours with his father, working, bonding, creating, was now being reduced to nothing more than a violation because it didn't conform to someone else's narrow, rigid idea of what was acceptable. The thought made him sick. He tried to argue, his voice tight with frustration. You're telling me that my garage, the one I've had for years, is a problem when there are houses down the street with garages that are either falling apart or look like mansions? Lisa didn't flinch. She didn't even look up, just nodded once, as though she had already dismissed his concerns. The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Matthews. There's nothing special about your situation. This isn't about what's fair. It's about control. The words stung, but Aaron didn't back down. He wanted to say more, to point out every inconsistency he had noticed in the neighborhood, to show her that this was more than just about aesthetics. But Lisa's disinterested gaze made it clear that no amount of reasoning would matter. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to enforce the rules. Her rules. Aaron left the office in a haze of anger and disbelief, his mind spinning. He had always been a man who believed in fairness, in common sense. But standing there in that cold, sterile office, he realized that fairness had no place in the HOA's world. They were untouchable. His garage, his memories, his pride, meant nothing to them. They had the power, and in that moment, Aaron felt like he had none. That night, as Aaron sat in his favorite armchair, Jenna's attempts to comfort him felt like little more than a distant echo. She spoke softly, her words meant to soothe, but they only made him feel more isolated. He wasn't angry at her, he was angry at everything. This wasn't just a petty dispute over a garage. This was an attack on his life, on the things that made him who he was. His garage, with its worn-out tools and the faint scent of motor oil, held memories of better days. Days spent working side by side with his father, building something real, something lasting. And now, those memories were being threatened by a faceless bureaucracy. The more he thought about it, the hotter his rage burned. The HOA's heavy-handed tactics, their complete disregard for his personal space, felt like an infringement on his very identity. He couldn't just let it slide, he refused to. He had spent years building a life here, and he wouldn't let some board of faceless people tear it down without a fight. The next few nights, Aaron buried himself in the HOA's bylaws. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he combed through endless pages of legal jargon, hoping for some kind of crack, some way to fight back. Then, in the middle of one long, sleepless night, he found it. A detail hidden in plain sight. The HOA had no legal authority to enforce its rules without majority approval from the neighborhood. And that approval? It had never happened. The HOA had been operating outside the law. Aaron's heart raced. This was it. His opening. Armed with this newfound knowledge, he began reaching out to his neighbors. He knocked on doors, made phone calls, and rallied the ones who shared his frustrations about the HOA's overreach. Slowly but surely, they began to stand behind him. Many of them, it turned out, were just as fed up with the HOA's constant meddling as he was. With legal backing and the support of his neighbors, Aaron filed a legal challenge. He argued that the HOA had been acting without proper authority, an argument that, if true, could dismantle everything they had imposed on the community. But he didn't stop there. As he dug deeper into the HOA's operations, he uncovered something else. Lisa Grant, the board president, had failed to disclose key documents in previous enforcement actions. This was a game changer. It wasn't just about his garage anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had been festering in their neighborhood for far too long. Aaron was ready to take them down. The court date arrived. Lisa Grant sat in her expensive suit, confident that her HOA had the upper hand. But Aaron stood firm, holding up the documents that revealed her unlawful actions. He argued that the HOA could not demand changes from homeowners unless it had followed specific procedural steps. He had the law on his side, and it was clear from the evidence that the HOA had violated its own rules. The judge ruled in Aaron's favor, ordering that not only was his garage to remain intact, but that the HOA would have to pay for all his legal fees. The satisfaction of seeing Lisa's smug face twist into disbelief as the verdict was read was priceless. Aaron's garage stood as a symbol of his victory. He hadn't just won his battle, he had exposed the overreach of an organization that thrived on intimidation. The once feared HOA was now forced to reassess its grip on the neighborhood. In the end, Aaron knew he'd won more than just a legal battle. He'd reclaimed his sense of justice.